Hey guys, tonight we step straight into the half-forgotten glow of an Edwardian midsummer, where bonfires crackle across hills you swear you've never heard of, and half the people tending them insist they're reviving a 3,000-year-old Celtic tradition, even though they're also wearing very sensible 1908 walking boots. The night presses warm against your cheeks, the smoke curls up like it's trying to memorize the stars, and you drift right into the middle of a moment nobody expected to matter so much. You probably won't survive the pollen count, by the way. Edwardian countryside air hits like a freight train of wildflowers. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step forward and the story folds around you. No jump cut, no title card, just the damp grass under your shoes and a lantern swinging in your hand before dawn. The light is thin, the kind that makes everything look like it belongs in a watercolor you once tried to paint and absolutely ruined. Edwardian Britain sits hushed around you, not yet electrified enough to banish shadows completely. You trudge along a sloping lane while a small group of antiquarians, those scholarly thrill-seekers who think dusty parish records count as adrenaline, amble ahead of you. One of them keeps whispering about liminal hours, which is your first hint that you're not going back to bed anytime soon. They've dragged you out here because, according to the latest issue of Folklore magazine, a very real thing, mainstream fact alert, midsummer traditions aren't dead at all. They're just hiding. Somewhere between superstition, communal habit, and the British fondness for lighting things on fire when bored, a handful of old customs have quietly survived. Historians still argue whether these tiny lingering sparks are true Celtic holdovers or just amiable Victorian fantasies people forgot to cancel. But right now, with the dew still clinging to your sleeves, the debate feels far away. You're heading to a hamlet tucked behind a ridge, supposedly one of those places where midsummer never entirely stopped. A local farmer, thin, suspicious, and already chewing something that looks like a twig, waits for you by a stile. He nods, jerks his chin toward a hill, and mutters, "If you're wanting to see the lanterns, best hurry." His accent is thick enough to spread on toast. As you climb, the antiquarians chatter. One pulls out a notebook labeled Midsummer Fire Practices, Provisional Map, which is a fancy way of saying he has absolutely no idea what he's doing. Another rummages in her satchel for a pamphlet promising authentic Celtic solar rites, originally written by someone who may or may not have improvised half of it during a hangover. This is your first encounter with a running Edwardian theme. Nobody fully agrees on what Celtic even means, but everyone's excited about it. The wind carries a faint herbal scent, sweet, dry, almost minty. One antiquarian leans over and says, "That's mugwort." People used to burn it for protection on Midsummer Eve. Whether that's an actual historical practice or the world's most confident guess remains up for debate, but it adds a nice mystical touch to your uphill walk. A little farther on, you make out a cluster of figures on the ridge. No bonfire yet, just lanterns held low, yellow glimmers turning the grass into a shifting sea of shadows. It's too early for ceremony, too late for sleep, and you're stuck in that delicious in-between state where everything feels possible. You breathe in, and the morning air tastes like damp hay and someone else's excitement. The local historian, every village has one, steps forward. His mustache is magnificent, by the way, the kind of mustache that legally qualifies as a historical artifact all on its own. He introduces himself and explains why you're here. Each year, a handful of families gather before dawn to walk the ridge with lanterns, tracing what they believe was once a protective circuit around the fields. Keeps the blight off, he says. Or so my gran claimed. It's your quirky tidbit for the night. Edwardians absolutely love the idea of ancient agrarian magic, especially when it might improve crop yields. Who would? You join the slow procession, your lantern swaying in rhythm with the others. The group moves deliberately, almost solemnly, though one barefoot child keeps hopping between rocks like he's playing a game only he understands. Nobody scolds him. The whole scene seems too fragile for adult corrections. The historian mutters that Victorian folklorists misunderstood nearly everything about these customs, but at least they wrote it all down, which is very British of them. The path curves. The ridge opens. And suddenly the sky begins to pale, not sunrise yet, just the hint of it, a smudge of silver behind low clouds. You feel the hush ripple through the group. Even the hopping child slows down. Then, almost as if on cue, the farmer from earlier steps forward and unhooks a small clay pot from his belt. He crouches, taps its lid, and reveals a little ember, glowing red like it's been waiting all night for permission to matter. You weren't expecting that. He lifts the ember to a tuft of dry grass, blows gently, and the flame catches with a soft F-cratch, a sound like fire remembering itself. The antiquarians nearly faint from joy. This isn't the grand bonfire the Edwardians want to rebuild, not yet. This is a seed flame, a symbolic survivor of last year's midsummer fire, kept smoldering in secret. You watch the farmer pass the flame to a younger man who lights his lantern directly from it. There's a reverence in his grip, as though he's holding a whole lineage of summers in one trembling wick. Someone whispers, continuity. Someone else says, imagine how old this tradition might be. And then another pipes up with, historians still argue whether burning a single perpetual ember is even historically Celtic. You can't help smirking. Academic bickering has never felt so atmospheric. As the lanterns flare brighter, the ridge comes alive. The procession moves again, tracing a route that feels ritualistic even if nobody can quite justify why. You trail behind, your footsteps softened by the grass, your lantern flickering like it's trying to wink at the breeze. Down below, the farms look peaceful, the hedgerows need a stitching. Somewhere a rooster crows, possibly offended that humans dared to wake up before him. You round a bend and glimpse the sea far in the distance, steel gray, restless, constantly rewriting its own edges. It makes the moment feel larger, stretched between land and myth. One antiquarian notes that midsummer fire traditions once spanned across Europe, from Scandinavian hilltop blazes to French wheel-rolling rituals. He says this while nearly tripping over a rabbit hole, which adds a nice dose of humility to his cultural survey. You catch him, steady him, and he murmurs thanks like you've saved his dissertation. The last segment of the ridge tilts upward. The lanterns gather, forming a glowing crescent around a bare patch of earth. This is the place, the historian says, the old starting point, the lanterns before dawn moment that kicks off the day's larger revival plans. The Edwardians hope that if they can document and photograph this quiet ritual, they'll have the perfect before picture for a much bigger fire celebration later. For now, though, it's just you, a few locals keeping tradition alive, and a handful of scholarly optimists who haven't slept properly since 1897. The farmer nods again. The younger man lifts his lantern higher, and as the clouds thin just enough for the first softening of sunrise, you feel the old and new layers of midsummer brush against each other. Fragile, improvised, mysterious, but undeniably alive. The Edwardian revival hasn't begun in full yet. But standing here, wrapped in smoke and anticipation, you already sense how one ember, one tiny, stubborn ember, can spark a whole cultural reawakening. You barely have time to rub the sleep from your eyes before the antiquarians are herding you down the ridge like overly excited sheepdogs. The lantern procession wraps up with a few nods, a few muttered blessings over the fields, and one child who insists on poking the last ember with a stick until his grandmother smacks his hand. The sun climbs higher, washing the grass in gold, and that's your cue to follow the scholars. Because apparently the real action doesn't happen at dawn. It happens when everyone has just enough breakfast and caffeine to start making questionable historical decisions. You trudge along a path littered with nettles, the sort that snag your socks and make you reconsider your entire life's direction. The antiquarians chatter ahead, clutching notebooks already swollen with scribbled theories. Their excitement is contagious. Or maybe it's just the adrenaline of nearly twisting your ankle 3 times in 5 minutes. Hard to say. You finally reach the top of another small hill, a lump of land that doesn't look special at first, until you see the stone ring half buried in the grass. A local shepherd swears it's ancient Celtic, though it might also be an 18th century farmer's attempt at creative landscaping. Historians still argue whether any of the stones currently worshipped by Edwardians were originally meant for worship at all, but arguments rarely stop people from believing what feels good. A group of scholars waits for you there, standing around a crate marked fragile, lantern fuel. That's a hopeful label. You know very well that if Edwardian scholars had been given access to industrial-grade explosives, several archaeological sites would no longer exist. They greet you with the solemnity of priests preparing for a ritual. Then one of them sneezes loudly, ruining the effect entirely. The leader, a thin man with spectacles forever sliding down his nose, pushes them back up and gestures for you to come closer. "We're about to test it," he whispers, like he's revealing the location of a hidden treasure chest. The ancient method of summoning the solstice flame. You brace for something dramatic, a chant, a staff, maybe a goat. But what they actually do is open a leather-bound book titled Celtic Fire Rites, Reconstructed, which is basically the Edwardian equivalent of Googling how to light mystical flames. The book was compiled by Victorians who were enthusiastic, creative, and only loosely tethered to academic rigor. One chapter was almost certainly inspired by a stage play. Another references Druidic foot positions, which nobody can demonstrate without falling over. Still, for a handful of people determined to resurrect midsummer magic, this is the good stuff. The leader clears his throat. "According to the text," he says, "we need to face east, touch the earth, and breathe the morning air while invoking the sun." He says this with such confidence you'd think he helped write the original Iron Age manual. You join them in forming a ragged semicircle. Someone says, "Wait, is this east?" Someone else rotates 90 degrees. The group ends up facing a cow which looks mildly offended. Eventually, they sort themselves out and you try to follow along. You crouch. You press your palm to the damp ground. The soil is cool and crumbly, full of the scent of growing things. You breathe in the air, dew, grass, and that faint smoke of the ember ceremony you just left. There's something quiet here, something old in the way all land is old, and for a moment you feel the pull of it. Then one of the scholars loudly cracks his back and mutters, "My doctor is going to kill me." The solemnity dissolves again, but they persist, bless them. Edwardian folklorists are nothing if not stubborn. This morning ritual is part reenactment, part experiment, and part performance for themselves, because the more they do it, the more real it feels. You lean into that feeling, breathing slowly as sunlight glints off the stones. There's beauty in the attempt, even if nobody is entirely sure what they're reviving. A younger scholar steps forward, holding a box of matches. "All right," she says, "let's test the herb bundle." She removes a twist of dried plants tied with red thread, midsummer herbs harvested at dawn according to tradition. Mugwort, rosemary, vervain. Whether Iron Age people ever actually used this bundle is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate, but it smells wonderful. She lights it. Smoke curls upward, white and fragrant, drifting across the stones like a lazy ghost. The scholars gasp as though witnessing ancient magic, and honestly, you almost feel it too. The morning air shimmers slightly with heat. The smoke twists in curious, looping shapes, nothing mystical, just a breeze with personality, but the effect is strangely entrancing. You're swept into the moment. The scholars begin murmuring observations. See how the smoke rises straight at first, ominous. That's not ominous, that's humidity. Historians still argue whether humidity can be considered a form of omen. You let them go on. They're harmless, endearing even, and weirdly committed to the idea that the universe leaves clues for people who wake up painfully early. Someone retrieves a tin cup filled with spring water, blessed by proximity to a standing stone, which is a polite way of saying it came from a puddle nearby. Another lays out charcoal fragments found in a rabbit hole, convinced they might be remnants of an ancient fire. They're probably just from a shepherd's campfire 10 winters ago, but in Edwardian folklore work, wishful thinking is basically a research method. Then comes the real spectacle. One scholar, tall, bearded, the type who always secretly hopes someone will mistake him for a druid, produces a polished wooden instrument with 2 handles. "Fire drill," he says proudly. "Bronze Age technology." It looks like the world's least effective coffee grinder. He braces it between his boots and starts drilling. Wood squeaks, dust gathers, his brow furrows, his arms tremble. You try not to laugh, but the sound he's making is halfway between a squeaky door hinge and a ship's wheel being turned by a ghost with arthritis. After 5 minutes of this, he stops, panting. "Almost got it," he says. He did not almost get it. Another scholar tries, then another. The third person loses control of the drill and sends it bouncing across the grass like an out-of-shape squirrel. You retrieve it for them, making a mental note that ancient fire-making was clearly invented by people with better upper body strength. Finally, the youngest member of the group, the only one who looks like she regularly carries furniture upstairs, takes the drill and produces an actual wisp of smoke within 20 seconds. The group cheers, almost toppling over each other. You can't help grinning. Suddenly, the spark blossoms, the dusk glows, and a tiny flame flickers into existence. It's small, pathetic almost, but to them it's a victory worthy of song. They cradle it like it's a newborn star. The flame grows just enough to light a fist-sized bundle of dry grass. The smoke swells again, richly scented, twisting upward as if eager to join the rising sun. You feel something stir inside you, a strange warmth that isn't from the flame itself but from the collective joy around it. This is why they're here, why they woke you in the middle of the night, why they're determined to find echoes of forgotten midsummer rites in country villages. It's not just scholarship, it's longing, an Edwardian hunger for meaning, continuity, myth, and a world that feels bigger than the one they inherited. You watch them record everything: measurements of smoke height, notes on flame color, sketches of herb bundles. The tall druid wannabe even tries measuring the length of his own shadow, muttering something about solstice solar angles. He insists it's symbolic. It is not symbolic, it's just geometry. Still, the commitment is glorious. A local shepherd wanders by, glances at the fire drill and the bundle of herbs, shrugs and says, "You lot know you could just use flint, right?" The scholars collectively pretend not to hear him. That's how you know they're serious. By midday, the experiment is complete. The scholars have proven that ancient fire-making methods can still work, though they don't mention how many attempts it took. They pack their notebooks and tools with the solemn care of people preparing a sacred relic for transit. You pause at the stone ring before leaving, letting your fingers graze the cool, lichen-spotted surface. The sunlight is warm on your shoulders. The smoke taste lingers faintly on your tongue. And somewhere in the distance, you swear you still hear the echo of that tiny flame catching, an ember of something older than all of you, or maybe just a good story you're choosing to believe. Either way, the Edwardian reawakening has begun, and you're walking right into the heart of it. You barely get a breath of calm before the antiquarians whisk you into a scene that feels like the world's gentlest bureaucratic fever dream. The sun is comfortably overhead now, warming the rooftops of a nearby village, and you drift toward the town hall, an Edwardian brick building with windows that look permanently surprised, like it wasn't prepared to host anything as dramatic as a midsummer revival committee. Inside, you're greeted by the sound of passionate argument mixed with the clink of teacups. The midsummer revivalists have convened their first big torchlight committee meeting, which sounds thrilling, but in reality involves a group of people in stiff collars talking very loudly about torch safety. You take a seat in the back, where the chair is slightly wobbly, as if someone already tried escaping from it once. On the table sits a stack of papers labeled Proposed Torch Regulations, which is a phrase you never expected to encounter in a mystical Celtic fire story. You give the list a quick glance and see items like torch length must not exceed 3 feet, no accelerants except those approved by the fire officer, and no summoning of entities, real or speculative. You're pretty sure someone added that last one as a joke, but the chairwoman hasn't crossed it out, so maybe not. The meeting begins with a flourish as the committee secretary clears his throat dramatically, then loses his place, then clears his throat again. You watch the ritual unfold with the tolerance of someone who has already seen antiquarians try to start fire by rotating sticks. Bureaucracy is, apparently, the next logical element. The chairwoman, a brisk woman with spectacles that could cut glass, announces, "We are here to finalize the details of the annual midsummer torch procession." Everyone applauds politely, except one old man who claps once and then immediately looks regretful. His mustache droops like it has opinions. A map of the village is unfurled across the table. The chairwoman uses a knitting needle as a pointer, tapping roots and corners until the paper ripples like a nervous horse. She outlines 2 proposed paths for the procession, one scenic, winding past the mill, and one practical, avoiding all places where teenagers might cause trouble. A debate erupts instantly. Half the committee advocates for historical accuracy, the other half for not setting the mill on fire. You lean back, enjoying the show. A folklorist stands up. He insists the procession must follow the ancient alignment, though he refuses to define what that means, and you suspect he's improvising based on the direction of the nearest sunbeam. Historians still argue whether midsummer processions ever followed alignments at all, but the Edwardians are determined to find patterns even where nature stubbornly refuses to provide them. A local blacksmith interrupts. "If people walk near the forge," he says, "someone's going to drop a torch in my scrap pile and that'll be the end of all of us." He makes this sound like a prophecy. You instantly admire him. The debate swirls. Tea is poured. Biscuits circulate. The secretary tries to take minutes but keeps drifting into sketching the chairwoman as a heroic figure holding a flaming torch. You glance over his shoulder. She looks vaguely like Athena, which is generous considering she just knocked over her 3rd teacup of the afternoon. Then comes the issue of authenticity. A young folklorist stands up and says, "If we are reviving Celtic rites, shouldn't we research the correct torch shapes?" He then produces a stack of illustrations from various antiquarian books, some showing tapered torches, some showing torch baskets, and one that definitely looks like someone glued twigs together in a moment of panic. The room leans in. Everyone murmurs. One man squints at an illustration and says, "That looks like a broom." Another suggests they consult local elders who, he assures everyone, probably remember how torches were made in 1730. The elders in the room glare at him. None of them were alive in 1730, but the implication is noted. Then the chairwoman reveals the draft budget for torch materials. This is when the real drama begins. Torches cost money. Tar costs money. Pitch costs money. The mayor's wife objects to using pitch because it stains terribly. The reverend opposes tar because the smell is unbecoming of a Christian festival. The folklorists oppose both suggestions because the Celts would have used something more symbolically resonant. Everyone opposes kerosene because they saw what happened last year when someone forgot how accelerants work and nearly launched a torch into a cabbage patch. You have to admire these people. They're trying to reawaken ancient magic while also making sure the insurance forms are filled out correctly. Just when the debate reaches a fever pitch, a small woman with wool-gray hair speaks up. She's been silent until now, her knitting needles clicking softly. She clears her throat and says, "If you want to know what my grandmother did, you're all overthinking it." Instant silence. She explains that in her childhood, families who lit midsummer torches simply dipped bundled branches in melted tallow or grease, tied them tight with twine, and hoped for the best. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't mystical. It was practical, smoky, and very effective at keeping insects away. You feel the ripple of disappointment drift across the scholars. They were hoping for sacred rites, golden torches, maybe a chant involving moonlight. But the truth has a charming simplicity to it. And honestly, a torch made of tallow-soaked sticks feels more real than any gilded Celtic recreation. The committee reluctantly agrees to use the traditional method. The folklorists console themselves by declaring tallow symbolic of agrarian continuity, which is the kind of academic spin nobody asked for but everyone accepts. Then a new debate arises. Who will lead the procession? The mayor wants the honor, naturally. The folklorists argue that someone knowledgeable in tradition should lead. The vicar suggests that since fire is dangerous, perhaps the leader should be someone trained to handle it, like the blacksmith. The blacksmith responds by shrinking into his chair and mumbling, "I don't even like candles." Eventually they settle on a compromise. A young schoolteacher, beloved in the village, level-headed and slightly taller than average. Height seems to be the deciding factor. If you can hold a torch without accidentally hitting a child, you're eligible. The meeting winds down. Decisions have been made, mostly, at least 50%. The secretary has written minutes that are technically accurate but illustrated heavily enough to be classified as fan art. As the scholars and villagers pack up, you catch a few lingering conversations, small, private excitements. Imagine the photographs. This will put our village on the map. Do you think the Celts had processions like this? Historians still argue whether they did anything communal at midsummer beyond lighting fires. My cousin says he'll come from Bristol for it. He thinks it'll be like a carnival. You step outside into the late afternoon light. The village hums with anticipation. Already you spot children pretending to march with imaginary torches, teenagers speculating about where the best view will be, and one elderly man crafting a wooden pole just in case they run out. The air smells like sawdust and early summer grass. The revival is beginning to take shape, not just in theory but in plans, routes, torches, and arguments. You can feel the momentum building. A fire doesn't start big. It starts with careful kindling, a spark, and the will to see it catch. And here, in this tiny hall filled with teacups and too many opinions, you've just watched the first flames take hold. You step into the rehearsal field just as the morning fog is lifting, revealing a circle of volunteers who look both determined and mildly bewildered. Each one clutches a sheet of instructions titled Rites of the Sacred Flame INTERPRETIVE edition. The word interpretive is doing more heavy lifting than any of the participants. A woman wearing a crown of artificial hawthorn boughs greets you with a breathless whisper. We're about to begin the sun-circling dance. Again. She gestures toward a cluster of people standing in a wide ring, all squinting toward an imaginary horizon. At the center of the circle is the ritual director, a soft-spoken man with intense enthusiasm and a cloak that swishes dramatically even though it's made of dyed bedsheets. He lifts his staff, which appears to be a broom handle decorated with ribbons. "Remember," he says, "the Edwardians believed these medieval rites called upon the cosmic harmony of ancient Britain." He pauses, listening to his own words with pride. Even if most of them were invented by Victorian gentlemen who collected folklore the way others collected postage stamps. The volunteers nod seriously, accepting this blend of mysticism and historical footnotes. "Sunward," he cries. The entire circle begins turning clockwise, arms lifted as though pulling warmth from the sky. You join the movement, feeling both reverent and slightly dizzy. The grass beneath your feet is still wet, and half the dancers slip just enough to disrupt the solemnity. A man near you whispers, "The Victorians must have rehearsed this on dry ground," before nearly falling into a shrub. After 3 rotations, the ritual director raises his broom staff again. "Beautiful," he says, ignoring that several people have accidentally drifted into a spiral formation. Now, transition into the flame-welcoming gesture. The volunteers attempt to shift into a pose described in their instruction sheets as an arc of human warmth. No one knows what that means, so what emerges is a collection of arm movements ranging from graceful to dangerously flailing. You watch as 2 participants nearly collide, their gestures looking less like sacred invocation and more like warding off an aggressive goose. Still, there is charm in the chaos. The Edwardians who assembled the original pageant instructions insisted that these rituals were rooted in ancient Druidic practice. In truth, many came from Victorian Celtic enthusiasts who spent their weekends inventing spiritual traditions while picnicking on hillsides. The ritual director is fully aware of this, yet he treats every movement with theatrical reverence. He claps his hands. "Excellent. Now we proceed to the chant." The group gathers closely, forming a lopsided circle. The director unrolls a parchment-like sheet, actually parchment-textured stationery he ordered because authenticity boosts morale. He clears his throat. This is the hymn of the dawn fire, as reconstructed by Reverend Thistledown in 1889. You've read about Reverend Thistledown. He once claimed to have rediscovered the lost tongue of the Druids, which turned out to be a blend of Welsh, Gaelic, and words he made up because they felt correct. The director begins reciting, "Orantha mori Ellen, sola bren atar." The volunteers echo the words with varying degrees of confidence. One man mispronounces everything so spectacularly that his neighbor discreetly hands him the phonetic version. Another volunteer mouths the syllables without making sound, focusing entirely on looking mystical. The chant grows louder, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Perhaps it doesn't matter that the words aren't truly ancient. What matters is the sincerity, the attempt to channel something old, something elemental, even if the blueprint for it was drafted over Victorian tea. As the chant reaches its final crescendo, the ritual director thrusts his staff skyward. "Ignis Vita," he shouts. Half the circle responds a beat late. A dog nearby starts barking. Someone's wreath slips over their eyes. "Marvelous," the director announces anyway. Then he gestures for everyone to sit. We'll now practice the fire-born rising, symbolizing rebirth and renewal. He demonstrates a gentle, flowing motion, arms lifting, torso rising, head tilting up as though greeting the sun. It looks serene when he does it. The volunteers attempt the same gesture and collectively resemble a field of startled marigolds. Yet slowly, after repeated attempts, the movements begin to sync. The gestures gain fluidity, then rhythm, then an almost believable sense of purpose. You feel it too, a strange warmth that isn't physical but communal. These people, with their improvised druidism and borrowed rituals, are creating something meaningful out of fragments. You catch the eye of a young volunteer who whispers, "Do you think the real druids ever moved like this?" You shrug. "Maybe not, but the Edwardians imagined they did, and we're imagining what they imagined." The volunteer grins. "So we're reenacting a reenactment." "Precisely." Rehearsal ends with a collective bow toward the imaginary sacred flame. The ritual director beams at the group. "You are vessels of ancient energy," he says, "reshaped by time, tradition, and enthusiastic scholarship." The volunteers applaud themselves. 2 hug. One vows to practice the chant in the bath. You walk away feeling oddly uplifted. The movements may be historically questionable, the chant linguistically fictional, and the authenticity debatable, but the spirit is genuine. In their earnest attempts to summon a ritual that never truly existed, The volunteers have created something altogether new, vibrant, and human. A flame born not from history, but from imagination. You wander toward the parish hall just as the rehearsal field settles back into its quiet rustling of grass and embarrassed retreat. A line of volunteers heads home to nurse twisted ankles and rehearse imaginary druidic vowels, but you're pulled instead toward the low stone building at the center of town. Light spills from its windows, warm, flickering, defensive. That is the glow of a meeting in progress, and you can already feel the tension radiating through the glass like heat from a half-doused fire. Inside, the scent of tea, wet wool, and quiet judgment greets you. 3 factions sit at 3 mismatched tables, each guarding their own stack of papers like small bureaucratic fortresses. At the front sit the parish representatives, stern-collared, resolutely upright, and possessed of a moral certainty that suggests they've never once slipped while performing a sun's circle dance. Across from them are the members of the mayor's office, practical and political, people who can smell a festival's tourism potential a mile away. And in the back, sipping lemon water with prickly self-importance, sits the Society for the Preservation of Public Decency, also known locally as the Busy Bees, because they buzz into every civic event with unsolicited opinions. You find a seat near the wall, close enough to listen but far enough to dodge flying hymnals, just in case someone starts citing Corinthians with too much enthusiasm. The Reverend clears his throat. "We must begin," he says, though the meeting has clearly been underway for half an hour. "The issue before us is whether this midsummer fire is appropriate for our community." A counselor from the mayor's office responds immediately, leaning forward with fingers steepled. "Appropriate. Reverend, it could bring hundreds, perhaps thousands. Visitors, lanterns, market stalls, economic uplift." He speaks the phrase economic uplift with the zeal of someone who has practiced saying it in the mirror. A busy bee interrupts. "And what of spiritual uplift?" she snaps. "These so-called rituals encourage dancing after dark, chanting in foreign words, and," she lowers her voice to a scandalized whisper, "bare feet in public." One of the parish women gasps. You're not sure if it's the chanting or the bare feet that offends her more. You sit quietly, letting the debate wash over you like waves from a very judgmental ocean. This scene isn't new. Scholars note that Edwardian communities often quarreled over revived folk customs, especially those involving fire. The historical fact that springs to your mind: a number of rural parishes in the early 1900s banned solstice bonfires entirely, worried they would become rowdy or pagan-themed distractions. You glance around. Yes, this group could have written those bans. A man from the mayor's office picks up a pamphlet titled "Renewal Through Light: The Benefits of a Midsummer Celebration," adorned with illustrations of smiling Edwardian families who definitely never argued over anything. He taps the cover. "This is a wholesome cultural revival," he insists. "A chance to honor heritage, to reaffirm community, to show our children the beauty of old customs." His voice brightens. "And to bring in much-needed lodging revenue." The parish clerk adjusts her spectacles. "But is it truly heritage?" she asks. Historians still argue whether midsummer bonfires in Britain had consistent spiritual meaning or were simply excuses for excessive merriment. A busy bee snorts. Excessive merriment is precisely the problem. You resist the urge to raise your hand and ask if moderate merriment might be allowed with a permit. The mayor himself hasn't spoken yet. He sits in the center of the room, leaning forward, contemplative, stroking his mustache in a rhythm that suggests he's calculating probability like a human abacus. When he does speak, his voice is deep and smooth, perfectly designed to sound authoritative in municipal disputes. "I understand all your concerns," he says, "but we should also acknowledge the growing trend. Towns across the region have revived these old Celtic flames, and they're receiving good press. Newspapers love photographs of glowing hillsides," He smiles. You know how fond journalists are of poetic symbolism. A busy bee hisses. They're fond of scandal, too. And we, the mayor replies coolly, will give them none. The Reverend leans back, hands folded. He looks tired, like a man who has spent too much time navigating committees. But what of the rituals themselves, he asks. Are we comfortable endorsing dances with uncertain origins? The sun's circling spins, the flame-welcoming gesture that nearly resulted in a sprained shoulder, the druidic chant invented by a Victorian clergyman with too much free time. You'd pay money to hear the Reverend's reaction to Reverend Thistledown's ancient syllables. It is symbolic, a counselor says, not literal. One of the parish representatives mutters, "Tell that to the Methodists." The busy bees begin murmuring amongst themselves, clutching their decency guidelines like talismans. Their leader finally stands, lifting her chin as though preparing to testify before an angelic tribunal. "We are not opposed to tradition," she says. "We are opposed to confusion. People should not be misled. This festival blurs the lines between history and invention." You want to applaud her commitment to academic integrity, even if it's delivered with the warmth of a tax audit. She's not wrong. Edwardian revivalists blurred lines constantly. Half the ancient festival elements they borrowed from folklore books written by men who had never seen a bonfire beyond their fireplace. But, she continues, if the event includes proper decorum, modest attire, clearly Christian framing, and no cavorting, then perhaps it is acceptable. The mayor raises an eyebrow. Define cavorting. Unstructured joy, she replies darkly. A wave of restrained laughter ripples through the mayor's office table. You hide your smile behind your sleeve. Someone from the parish committee whispers to the Reverend, "We could bless the fire." His eyebrows rise. Bless it. Yes, dedicate it as a symbol of light overcoming darkness. Reinterpret the event within a Christian framework. A counselor claps softly. Perfect harmony, a fusion of heritage and faith. But one of the busy bees bristles. A blessing may imply divine approval of barefoot dancing. Would you prefer footwear regulations? The mayor asks with genuine interest. She considers it, possibly. A young man at the back, someone you recognize from the rehearsal earlier, raises his hand timidly. "Excuse me," he says, "but isn't the point of midsummer to feel free, connected, like you're part of something older than any of us?" Everyone turns to him. He swallows. "I mean, we're trying to create a moment where people stand together around a fire and remember they're human. That's not immoral, that's beautiful." The room softens just a little. Even the Reverend's expression eases, like a candle flame catching a gentler draft. A parish woman says, "Beauty is good, but order is better." The mayor leans back, steepling his hands again. "Let us propose conditions," he says. "Reasonable ones." A list begins to form. Fire size capped at a height the fire brigade feels confident about. Dances supervised by someone who can distinguish enthusiasm from chaos. The chant approved for language that sounds reverent, not rowdy. A blessing offered. Footwear optional but recommended. No alcohol directly near the flames, only adjacent tents, which everyone pretends solves the issue. And most important, a clear statement in the program that the rituals are inspired by historic customs, not literal reenactments. "That last one," the Reverend says, "is essential." You nod. It's honest. And honesty, even when it reveals how much invention is involved, has its own kind of magic. The busy bees finally concede, provided they may hand out pamphlets reminding attendees to maintain decorum at all times, which you suspect will be politely ignored by anyone planning to whirl in the sun's circling dance. The mayor rises. "Then we have an agreement. The Midsummer Fire Festival is approved." A murmur spreads through the room, half relief, half apprehension. You feel a flutter in your chest too. Not fear exactly. More like the sensation you get when a match is struck in a dark room. Small, warm, hinting at something larger. As the meeting adjourns, you slip outside into the crisp evening. Lamps glow along the street. A church bell tolls 9 times, steady and restrained. Beyond the rooftops, the hill where the bonfire will rise looms softly in the dusk. The townspeople drift past you, some excited, some worried, some already rehearsing arguments to present to their families. You exhale, watching your breath fade into the night. Inside that parish hall, the community did something remarkable. Not perfect, not historically precise, not unanimous, but human. They negotiated a space where fear, tradition, invention, commerce, and hope could coexist. A space where a fire might safely burn. You follow the flow of townsfolk down a side street the next morning, drawn by the clatter of scissors, the thump of sewing machines, and the unmistakable murmur of artistic disagreement. The air smells of wool, chalk dust, and ambition. Someone sneezes violently into a cloud of fabric scraps. That's how you know you've reached the costume workshop, or as one volunteer calls it, the birthplace of questionable Celtic authenticity. Inside, chaos greets you like an enthusiastic dog. Tables overflow with bolts of linen, dyed shawls, embroidered panels, and mysterious bronze-colored accessories that look suspiciously like repurposed curtain rings. In the center of the room stands the head seamstress, a woman with silver hair pinned into a no-nonsense bun, and the posture of someone who has absolutely no time for nonsense, even though she is surrounded by nothing else. "We're behind schedule," she says the moment she notices you, though you didn't ask. "The druidic tunics are more complicated than the committee promised." She holds up a garment that looks like a cross between a monk's robe, a medieval tabard, and a picnic blanket. "Historians still argue whether any Celtic priest ever wore something like this," she adds with an exasperated snort. "But the Edwardians certainly believe they did, so now we must make 20. Around her, a battalion of volunteers stitches furiously. One woman embroiders spirals based on ancient stone carvings, squinting at a reference sketch. Another paints knotwork onto faux leather belts with a brush so tiny it must have been created for ants. A young man hems cloaks while trying not to impale himself on straight pins. He's losing the battle. You drift toward a group of antiquarians hunched over a book titled Celtic Costume, a definitive guide published in 1897. They flip pages with scholarly reverence, ignoring the fact that half the illustrations contradict one another. "This plate shows a ceremonial cape worn by a Bronze Age chieftain," one says. Another frowns. "No, that's clearly a mythological depiction." A third taps the margin. "It's actually taken from a Victorian stage play." They argue softly, as if debating sacred scripture instead of theatrical wardrobe. Eventually, they decide the cape is symbolically appropriate, which is academic code for we're using it whether it's real or not. Nearby, a costumer dyes strips of cloth in a simmering pot. The scent is earthy, herbal, vaguely alarming. "Madder root," she explains proudly. "Traditional red dye, perfect for authentic Celtic accents." She leans closer and whispers, "I added beet juice too, for vibrancy." You nod respectfully, deciding not to mention that the ancient Celts probably didn't supplement their pigments with items from the greengrocer. Someone calls out, "Does anyone know how long this headdress is supposed to be?" You turn to see a volunteer holding up what looks like a towering crown made of twigs, wildflowers, and too much optimism. It resembles a forest attempting to escape into the sky. The antiquarians gather, murmuring. "It should evoke natural power," one says. "Or celestial alignment," says another. "Or simply avoid decapitating the wearer when they bow," adds the seamstress sharply. They all agree on that last requirement, because practicality is the final line of defense in costume creation. As the volunteers continue stitching and debating symbolism, you wander toward the corner where a rack of half-finished outfits hangs. Some are stunning, flowing green garments adorned with swirling embroidery, cloaks that shimmer faintly with metallic thread, tunics decorated with stylized suns. Others are experimental. One cloak includes feathers, sequins, leather patches, and something that looks like a spoon. You choose not to ask. A teenage volunteer approaches, holding a strip of cloth dyed a luminous blue. Do you think this matches the ancient color palette? They ask earnestly. You answer gently. No one actually knows the exact palette, but if it feels right, it belongs. They beam. Artists love permission more than accuracy. Across the room, the seamstress suddenly claps her hands. All right, fittings. A flurry of fabric ensues. Volunteers duck behind screens, emerging in outfits at various stages of completion. Some look radiant, others resemble laundry that gained sentience. A man steps forward wearing a robe so long he nearly trips. The seamstress hems it with lightning speed, muttering, "Who designed this? A windmill? Still, there's beauty in the madness." Bits of genuine Celtic symbolism peek through the Edwardian embellishments. Spirals honoring eternal cycles, suns celebrating midsummer light, woven patterns echoing ancient stone carvings. Even the inaccurate pieces carry sincerity. The Edwardians weren't trying to deceive, they were trying to imagine, to revive, to create a past that felt meaningful. Someone calls for assistance with a ceremonial sash. You help tie it, noticing the embroidered knotwork, looping patterns that twist without beginning or end. It represents continuity, the volunteer tells you proudly. You know the connection between ancient fire festivals and our modern celebration. You smile. A good thing to wear near a bonfire. Or, they say with a conspiratorial wink, near the busy bees. By early evening, the workshop is a tangle of thread, laughter, and tired triumph. The seamstress surveys the room like a general inspecting her troops. "We'll have these finished by festival eve," she declares. Assuming no one adds any more antlers, silence falls. Slowly, 3 volunteers hide antlers behind their backs. The seamstress sighs. "Fine, but keep them small and securely attached." As you step outside, the cool air carries the scent of fabric dye lingering on your clothes. The hill where the bonfire will blaze stands dark against the twilight, waiting. You imagine it crowned with color, robes swirling, headdresses flickering in firelight, cloaks billowing with each turn of the sun's circle dance. It won't be historically precise, but it will be beautiful. And maybe, just maybe, the old Celtic flames don't need accuracy to feel alive. They just need people willing to imagine them into being. You wander down toward the village green the following morning, drawn by the smell of smoke, sawdust, and that indefinable tang of last-minute panic. The volunteers have gathered again, this time under the open sky, preparing the bonfire pyre. It is enormous, several meters high, piled with logs, branches, and bundles of brush. Someone has even added a small wooden effigy at the top, intended to symbolize the sun, or depending on who you ask, the spirit of midsummer mischief. You quietly wonder which. The bonfire committee, a hybrid of energetic villagers and scholarly enthusiasts, consults a series of hastily scrawled diagrams. Some resemble architectural blueprints, others look more like abstract art. One volunteer holds a ruler and squints at a drawing of the pyre's base. "Are we certain the structure won't collapse?" he asks, concern etched across his face. "Safety is paramount," replies the pyre coordinator. "But it must also look dramatic. Remember, this is Edwardian pageantry. No one remembers the fire if it isn't impressive." You step closer, feeling the faint warmth of the morning sun and the crisp smell of timber. Each log is stacked with meticulous care, forming tiers like a rough staircase for the flames to climb. You notice small bundles of dried herbs, mugwort, vervain, and rosemary, nestled between the logs, meant to scent the smoke and evoke mystical ambience. Historians still argue whether Iron Age peoples ever did this, but for the Edwardians, the symbolic effect was everything. A young woman adjusts the effigy, a stick figure with straw hair, and asks, "Do we chant when we light it?" The volunteer in charge of rituals smiles nervously. "Yes, but remember, our chants are reconstructed from Victorian hobbyists. Authenticity is optional. Enthusiasm is mandatory." You glance around. There is a circle of volunteers practicing movements around the pyre, arms raised in exaggerated arcs, slow spins that mimic the sun's path, and occasional leaps that look more like interpretive panic than ritual. One man trips over a log and lands with a soft thud, muttering something about being fire-bound. The ritual director, a tall man with spectacles and a broom staff, surveys the scene. Precision. He calls, though it is unclear whether he addresses the dancers, the pyre, or the universe itself. Every gesture must evoke reverence and awe. You follow the volunteers as they circle the pyre, feeling the sway of energy, clumsy, enthusiastic, and surprisingly compelling. Someone begins the reconstructed chant, a mix of syllables taken from Reverend Thistledown's Victorian notes. The words roll out, uneven and lilting, forming a rhythm that grows in confidence with each repetition. You find yourself joining in, caught in the communal pulse of the moment. A shepherd who wandered over from the fields watches quietly. He mutters, "You lot make more ceremony than the Druids ever did," and you can't tell if he's amused or impressed. As the smoke of nearby cooking fires drifts across the green, volunteers adjust their positions, refine their gestures, and practice raising the ceremonial torches. The director stops them repeatedly, offering corrections. Lower your elbow. Tilt the torch at 30 degrees. Imagine you are summoning the sun itself. By midday, the pyre is complete. Logs are stacked high, herbs woven through, and the effigy perched precariously at the top. Volunteers step back, admiring their work, while the director paces the perimeter, murmuring last-minute notes in his tattered notebook. You notice the subtle ways in which this Edwardian interpretation diverges from any historical account. The dances, the chants, even the pyre's construction. It is a mosaic of imagination layered atop imagination. Yet despite its inaccuracy, the fire they are about to light feels like something alive. As you watch, you realize that the essence of the festival isn't historical precision or scholarly correctness. It's participation. Each misplaced gesture, each imperfect chant, each improvised detail contributes to a shared creation, a midsummer fire that belongs not to the past, but to this moment, to these people, and to anyone willing to imagine ancient flames burning once more. The first spark, when it finally comes, will not just ignite wood. It will ignite belief, imagination, and a quiet, contagious thrill in every heart watching. You step back, letting the volunteers continue their final rehearsals, and for the first time, you sense the festival truly stirring. The Edwardians, the village, the legacy of imagined druids, all converging around a single flame that promises to leap into the night. You follow the trail of excitement to the village outskirts, where the festival's musical ensemble is testing instruments and improvising melodies meant to evoke ancient Celtic sounds. It's an eclectic mix: fiddles, flutes, a lone trumpet, and a drum whose skin is suspiciously patched with leather from old boots. The musicians frown at one another, tuning and retuning, attempting to reconcile historical inspiration with modern playability. A violinist mutters, "The Edwardians thought the Celts played like this," bowing vigorously. Historians still argue whether any instrument survived the Iron Age, but we're doing our best. You watch as volunteers carrying small torches practice walking in rhythm with the music. Their steps are hesitant at first. Many stumble over invisible obstacles, shuffle too fast, or forget which foot leads. Yet gradually, the rhythm synchronizes. By the third repetition, the procession looks almost intentional, a wave of flickering light moving in tandem with the clanging drumbeats. Nearby, a small group attempts the druidic chant of renewal, a Victorian invention lifted from dusty folkloric manuscripts. The words sound impressive but make little linguistic sense. One volunteer, eager to add drama, improvises a few high-pitched wails. Another accidentally chants Orantha as Aurora, eliciting muffled laughter from the director. He decides to leave it. Enthusiasm is worth more than perfection. You step closer to observe the subtle gestures accompanying the chants. Arms sweep skyward, hands trace invisible circles, and bodies tilt toward the imagined sun. Each participant interprets the movement differently, some fluidly, some with the grace of someone balancing on uneven cobblestones. You notice the same mixture of reverence and awkward joy that marked the rehearsals yesterday. The Edwardian approach is less about accuracy and more about feeling authentic, even if the authenticity is invented. One young man carrying a torch whispers to you, "Do you think anyone will notice that the chants aren't really ancient?" You smile. "No, they'll notice the fire, the rhythm, the human effort, that's enough." The drum beats intensify as the director calls for the sun circling sequence, the moment where the participants walk the pyre in a clockwise rotation, arms raised and torches held high. You join in, feeling the warmth of shared anticipation. The procession, though still imperfect, begins to feel like a living ritual. Shadows flicker across the green, creating a dynamic tapestry of light and movement. Suddenly, a gust of wind lifts some papers, scattering sheet music and instructions. Volunteers chase after them, laughing and shouting. The director sighs dramatically, then laughs himself, muttering, "Even chaos has its place in tradition." You pause to watch a teenage girl attempt a complicated turn while holding her torch. She nearly trips, but a nearby participant steadies her. There's a palpable sense of communal care. Everyone is invested not just in spectacle, but in each other. By afternoon, the rehearsals are winding down. The director gathers everyone around the pyre for a final check, adjusting torch angles, clarifying timing, and giving last-minute reminders about safety. The sun has dipped lower, casting golden light across the green, and the group's shadows stretch like elongated dancers, echoing centuries of imagined midsummer traditions. You realize that the festival's success doesn't depend on historical accuracy. It depends on human energy, imagination, and shared excitement. Every stumble, every improvised note, every mispronounced chant contributes to the sense that something ancient and magical is unfolding, even if it exists only because people have collectively willed it into being. As you step back to watch the last coordinated rehearsal, you feel it. The festival is no longer just a plan on paper. It is alive, flickering in anticipation of the fire, the music, and the dance that will soon transform the village green into a midsummer spectacle. You fall naturally into line as dusk gathers and the great procession finally begins, and there's no announcement, no clean moment of "now it starts." Just a quiet click inside everyone's chest where anticipation becomes movement. Torches are lifted. Boots scrape the dirt. The first drumbeat lands low and thick, like a heartbeat you didn't realize you were waiting for. You're handed a torch that feels heavier than it looks, the pitch-scented cloth wrapped around the top already smoldering faintly. Someone strikes a match. The flame takes with a soft, eager whoosh, and suddenly your hands are warm, your face is lit orange, and you look like you know what you're doing even though you absolutely don't. The line of torchbearers begins to snake through the village streets, and you move with them, step by step, in that strange shared rhythm that happens only in parades and mild emergencies. Windows glow from inside cottages. Curtains twitch. Children, wrapped in shawls and oversized coats, scurry forward to keep pace, their eyes wide with the sort of wonder that makes adults stand a little straighter. This is where the Edwardian genius really shows itself. They've turned folklore into theater. The procession isn't just walking, it's choreographed folklore, complete with timed pauses, symbolic gestures, and a schedule pinned to a tree back at the starting point that no one is following anymore. Behind you, a group of singers starts up one of those reconstructed Celtic hymns that was absolutely written in 1893. The melody drifts through the air, half haunting, half music hall sentimental. Historians still argue whether ancient Britain sang anything like this, but the emotional effect is undeniable. Even the village dog seems moved, though he might just be confused. As you pass the church, you spot the vicar standing at the gate, arms folded, face carefully neutral. He's lost the argument to stop the parade but won the right to observe for moral tone. He nods at you, which feels like a minor spiritual exam you somehow pass. The mayor appears next, walking stiffly alongside the procession in a sash he definitely had specially made for this occasion. He whispers to his aide, loudly enough for you to hear, "It's good for community unity." This is a mainstream historical truth of the time. Edwardian civic leaders loved anything that looked traditional, disciplined, and photographable. You turn a corner and the street opens into the long road leading uphill toward the hilltop clearing. This is where the mood shifts. The chatter dies down. The drum slows. The only sounds now are boots, breath, and the constant soft crackle of torches. Someone near you jokes under their breath, "If the ancient Celts could see this, they'd charge admission." You almost laugh out loud but settle for a snort, because dropping a torch would be socially catastrophic. Halfway up the slope, the wind picks up. The flames lean sideways, smoke streaming like banners. You smell pitch, hot cloth, summer grass, and the faint sweetness of crushed wildflowers underfoot. Every step feels heavier, not from exhaustion, but from the strange importance the group has decided this moment deserves. At the top, the bonfire looms. It's bigger now in the half-light, a jagged tower of wood and bundled herbs, the little straw effigy still perched at the crown like a tiny king awaiting his extremely fiery coronation. The crowd gathers in a wide circle, torches creating a wall of flickering gold. The ritual director raises his staff. Silence falls in a way that feels intentional, which is rare for this whole operation. Everyone lifts their torches in unison, or close enough that it counts. You raise yours too, arm trembling slightly, not from weakness but from the heat, the smoke, and the realization that you feel something. The chant begins. It's still Victorian nonsense wrapped in fake antiquity, but now it lands differently. The words vibrate in your chest. The circle tightens. People close their eyes. People peek to see if anyone else has closed their eyes. Finally, the chosen torchbearer steps forward. Their hands shake. Everyone's hands shake. The torch touches the dry kindling at the base. For a breathless second, nothing happens. Then the fire catches. Flame licks upward, small and then larger and then greedier, climbing through the scaffolding of wood. The herbs ignite, sending scented smoke into the twilight. The crowd exhales as one body, a sound halfway between a sigh and a prayer. You stand there, bathed in orange light, realizing that this parade, this messy, invented, heartfelt procession, has done its job. It has pulled you out of ordinary time and dropped you somewhere older feeling, even if only because everyone agreed to pretend together. And as the fire begins to roar, you feel it. The night is no longer a rehearsal. It's real. It's happening. You begin to notice the thinkers circling the edges of the fire before you ever really see them, the way you always sense people who have brought notebooks to a bonfire. While the crowd melts into awe and marshmallow-level reverence, these are the ones squinting through spectacles, murmuring theories, and treating the flames less like mystery and more like a laboratory that smells faintly of pine sap and ambition. One man crouches by a crate of glass bottles filled with powders. He introduces himself as a chromatic flame investigator, which sounds impressive, until he cheerfully admits he learned most of it from a chemistry pamphlet and a railway worker with opinions. Mainstream historical fact: Edwardian Britain was crawling with amateur scientific societies, and they treated festivals like this as chances to test ideas with minimal oversight and maximal enthusiasm. He tosses a pinch of something into a side flame. The fire flashes briefly green. The crowd murmurs. You whisper, "Magic," he whispers back, "copper salts." Both of you seem equally satisfied. A woman with a tightly pinned hat and an expression of permanent curiosity drags you toward a small table covered in tuning forks, magnets, coiled wires, and a notebook labeled Fire Vibrations. She strikes one of the forks and holds it near the burning logs, watching how the flame trembles and bends. This, she says, is where science meets spirit. Historians still argue whether experiments like this were sincere spiritual quests or just well-funded curiosity spirals, but the dedication is real either way. Nearby, a journalist scribbles furiously by firelight, muttering headlines to himself. Ancient pagan rite reborn, no, rural revival stuns onlookers. No, fire suggests deep ancestral memory. He notices you watching and whispers, "Do you think ancestral inferno is too much?" You tell him it's perfect, which is a kindness. You drift toward a group of mystically inclined observers who are convinced the fire emits seasonal energies. They hold small pendulums over hot stones, watching them sway. One of them insists, very seriously, that the direction of the swing confirms which crops will thrive. Another nods as if he didn't just base his farming strategy on a bit of string and vibes. At the same time, a proper academic type with a stiff collar is measuring the heat using a compact thermometer, frowning like the numbers personally offend him. He announces, to anyone who will listen, that the temperature curve proves something about ancient ritual timings. No one asks what. You glance back at the main blaze. It crackles and spits, sparks snapping upward into the night sky like tiny escaped stars. The straw effigy finally catches and flares, collapsing dramatically in a way that feels emotionally important but structurally predictable. A man next to you whispers, "That represents the dying of the old sun." Another whispers, "I thought it was meant to be mischief." Both feel correct. The musicians strike up again, this time faster, more confident. The drumming becomes insistent, almost hypnotic. You feel it in your feet before you feel it in your thoughts. Nearby, volunteers who swore they wouldn't dance find themselves very much dancing. Shoulders loosen, arms lift. Someone does a spin that feels like rebellion against modernity and possibly against tight-fitting boots. Scientists, mystics, and reporters all pause, just for a moment, and look less like observers and more like participants. One elderly man who claims to have studied comparative flame mythology for 40 years leans toward you and says, "The Romans, you know, had something rather like this." That, you murmur, feels like something Romans would do. Elhi nods solemnly, satisfied. You realize that this part of the night isn't about owning the fire, it's about interpreting it. Everyone here wants it to mean something different. Proof of ancient wisdom, proof of scientific progress, proof that modern life hasn't killed off wonder completely. The fire just keeps burning, completely unbothered by their theories. A gust of wind showers sparks into the dark. Collective gasp. No one moves. Edwardian risk assessment is happening in real time. As you watch the curl of smoke bend and twist upward, you understand that this isn't just a bonfire. It's a strange meeting point between past and future, chemistry and chant, symbols and statistics, myth and measurement. And somewhere in the middle of it all, you stand there, warmed by flame and surrounded by people who desperately want fire to answer questions it has no interest in answering. Still, it feels important. It feels alive. It feels like the world has briefly tilted back toward something older, even if it got there by way of test tubes and tuning forks. And as the fire roars higher, you realize the real experiment is already working. People believe in the night. You don't leave the fire so much as get carried away from it, swept along with rumors of other blazes blooming across the countryside like a chain reaction of borrowed sunlight. By morning, word has already traveled to neighboring villages, and by afternoon, you're being tugged toward a rattling coach where someone insists, very seriously, that 3 parishes lit their own solstice fires after hearing about ours. This is how it spreads. Not through official decrees, but through gossip, newspaper clippings, and the uniquely Edwardian belief that if something looks traditional enough, it probably deserves national attention. Mainstream historical fact. The early 1900s were a golden age of local history societies, and they loved copying each other's revived customs with almost competitive energy. You feel the wheels of the coach vibrate under you as you travel from village to village, watching the same idea grow new shapes. One town builds their bonfire in a ruined stone circle, even though the stones were actually arranged in the 18th century to make the farm look romantic. Another holds their fire in a churchyard and insists it symbolizes the harmony of old and new, while the vicar pretends he didn't see the pamphlets until it was too late. In Cornwall, you find a group who have gone completely off script. Their bonfire is shaped like a spiral, and they insist on jumping over the remaining embers for luck, fertility, and what they vaguely call seasonal courage. You consider it. You do not jump. You are strong. You are cautious. Someone tells you that in Wales, a town has synchronized their fire lighting to the exact second of sunset using pocket watches, and a man who claims he can feel the sun move. Historians still argue whether such precision has any ancient precedent or if it's just Edwardians being unable to resist schedules. You start to see patterns. Each town swears their version is the most authentic. Each council insists their symbolism is the oldest. Each group of volunteers argues about choreography, chants, and whether green-tinted flames feel too theatrical. In one village, you encounter a solstice coordination committee with badges. They hand you a list of approved ritual gestures, complete with small inked diagrams of arms and torches. You follow one for a moment and feel like a windmill trying to summon the sun. The fires themselves change depending on the region. Some burn slow and steady, some leap wildly, some crackle and throw sparks like they're gossiping with the sky. People bring offerings, handwritten wishes, tiny bundles of herbs, bits of ribbon, occasionally extremely suspicious pies. You overhear a woman telling her friend, "The fire burned blue for a moment, which means the harvest will be generous." Her friend replies, "Or it means someone threw copper in again." They both smile and decide to believe the first option. You realize what's happening. This isn't just a festival anymore. It's turning into a network. Letters are being written. Articles are being printed. Sketches of pyres and dances are being mailed to distant towns. You can almost feel the web growing, invisible but real. By the time you reach a small industrial town, the fire burns beside factory chimneys. Smoke from coal and smoke from pine wood twist together in the twilight. Men in work clothes stand shoulder to shoulder with women in flower crowns that definitely weren't worn 5 years ago. Children run in circles, glowing with reflected firelight. Someone leans toward you and says, "Feels like the country's waking up." It does. It feels like a strange, slow awakening, where people who have spent most of their lives inside smoke-belching modernity suddenly remember that fire once meant seasons, warmth, stories, and a sky not drowned in soot. You can feel it spreading beyond belief and into habit. Plans are made for next year, sketches improved, songs rewritten. The idea of midsummer fire starts to feel less like a revival and more like a tradition people simply expect. And as you stand between industrial brick walls and a flickering circle of orange light, you understand. You are watching a country quietly teaching itself how to dream backwards and forwards at the same time. The flames don't ask for permission. The people don't wait for proof. They just light the fire. You slip into a quieter corner of the movement now, where the firelight stops flickering wildly and starts burning like a steady, thoughtful flame. The crowds thin, the drums soften, and what's left are circles of people who want to argue politely and intensely about what any of this is actually supposed to mean. You sit on a low stone wall beside a group of men and women who are armed with notebooks, pipes, and extremely confident opinions. They speak in low, careful voices, the way people do when they believe they are handling something fragile and important. "This is not Celtic," one says, tapping ash from his pipe with great drama. "It's modern theatrical invention." Another replies without missing a breath, "But all traditions begin as inventions." You almost clap, but you don't want to become part of the debate. This is where you feel the intellectual heartbeat of the revival. Mainstream historical fact: Edwardian Britain was deeply obsessed with heritage, and entire societies were founded to define what counted as authentic folklore. Unfortunately, they rarely agreed with each other. Historians still argue whether these fire festivals were acts of cultural preservation or acts of imaginative reconstruction, and you can feel that exact argument happening right beside you. One woman presents a carefully folded paper covered in hand-drawn spirals. She insists these are authentic symbolic motions passed down orally for centuries. A man across from her coughs gently and says, "That's my handwriting from last winter." Nobody acknowledges this out loud. You overhear arguments about language. Should the chants be in Welsh, Cornish, Old Irish, a reconstructed Proto-Celtic that no one here can actually speak? One gentleman suggests Latin because it feels authoritative. That idea is quietly moved to the probably not pile. You walk through clusters of discussion where people debate whether jumping fires is real tradition or rural showmanship. Another group is convinced the effigy burning represents agricultural cycles. Someone else thinks it symbolizes the burning away of industrial anxieties, which feels accidentally honest. A quiet print journalist sits nearby, drawing a little cartoon of two scholars fighting over a flaming log while the countryside burns happily behind them. You appreciate this more than feels socially acceptable. You begin to understand that what's being fought over isn't fire, it's ownership. Who gets to say what is real? Who gets to define the past? Who gets to decide that a feeling of warmth belongs to one history and not another? Someone turns to you and asks, "Don't you think this used to be more sacred?" You think about the mistimed chants, the copper-colored flames, the shepherd's smirk, the child who fell asleep by the firelight. You answer honestly, "I think people have always been messy." They smile like that answers more than they expected. As the fire crackles lower, the arguments grow softer. The fire becomes background instead of centerpiece. Smoke drifts upward in lazy curls and the night air cools around your shoulders. You realize that this, too, is part of the ritual. Not the fire, but the conversation afterward. The need to explain it. The need to box it. The need to label it as old or new, real or fake, sacred or civic. But the fire doesn't care. It never did. And as you walk away from the circles of murmured debate, you feel that you're carrying something quieter now. The understanding that tradition isn't a fossil. It's a living argument that crackles and glows long after the loudest flames have burned down. You arrive on a ridge just before sunset, breath catching in your chest not from the climb but from what you see unfolding across the horizon. Because tonight is not about a single fire, or a single village, or even a single county. Tonight is about coordination on a scale that feels wildly optimistic and only barely sensible. The year of 1,000 fires, the moment when dozens of coordinated hilltop bonfires are to be lit at once, trying to stitch the country together with lines of flame. Below you, the land rolls out in dark folds of pasture, hedgerow, and distant village roofs. To your left, another hill rises, and on its crown you can already see silhouettes of people piling wood. To your right, a far-off ridge sits in quiet anticipation. Each one is waiting for the same signal, the same moment, the same tiny flare of light that will begin something far larger than any of them fully understand. The mainstream historical truth thrums beneath all this theatricality. Edwardian Britain was obsessed with synchronized public spectacle. Not just parades and jubilees, but timed events, coordinated actions, clock-obsessed unity. Pocket watches are checked with trembling intensity. A man is appointed solely to confirm when the sun has officially dipped past the horizon, as if the sky might lie to him. You stand among volunteers who are trying very hard to look calm. They are not calm. They are wrapped in shawls, lanterns ready, matches dry in tins, faces powdered with soot that may or may not be ceremonial. The fire stack rests in front of you, taller than a small cottage and smelling strongly of pine pitch, summer grass, and an overconfident amount of dried herbs. Someone whispers, "If this works, they'll be writing about it for years." Someone whispers back, "If it doesn't, we'll pretend it was symbolic." The wind tugs at your coat. The air tastes like metal and leaf and the faint electric tension of a country trying to light itself up all at once. A horn sounds in the distance, not close, far. It carries across the valley in a low, drifting note. This is the signal, or it might not be. Everyone decides that it is. Torches are lifted. Matches are struck. That sharp sulfur scent flicks across your senses like a slap awake. You watch fingers shake as flame blooms unexpectedly large, briefly too hot, briefly too alive. The chosen lighter steps forward. They hesitate. You feel the weight of all those waiting ridges pressing into that pause. Then the torch presses in. The fire catches low, small, almost shy at first. A flicker, a test. And then, as if remembering its job, it climbs, it breathes, it takes. It surges upward through stacked wood and bundled brush, devouring herbs that spit fragrant smoke. Sparks rise like flung stars. Heat blooms against your face. You turn slowly, scanning the darkening horizon. One hill lights, then another, then another. Distant flickers bloom into full, pulsing crowns of fire, each one answering the others in silent, burning conversation. A string of light stitches its way along the spine of the land. The crowd gasps, not loudly, but in that quiet, broken breath way that means they feel something too large to clap for. You feel it too. This is where the open scholarly argument hangs in the air. Historians still argue whether these synchronized blazes were genuine attempts to reawaken a shared ancestral memory or simply an Edwardian experiment in national choreography. Standing here, it doesn't really matter. The emotional truth is louder than the academic one. Someone near you laughs, half sobbing. Someone else whispers, "Look at that, look at all of us." For a long while, no one speaks. The fires burn high. Wind leans their flames in the same direction, like they're bowing to the same god. Smoke from multiple hills blends into a low, hazy band across the sky. It smells sweet, sharp, alive. A layered perfume of thousands of hands building thousands of dreams out of dry branches. Down below, faint echoes of drums float up from valleys. You can't quite hear the rhythm, but you can feel that other people are dancing somewhere. Other people are chanting, messing up words, laughing, crying, holding hands too tight. And then, because this is always how it happens, something imperfect creeps in. One distant hill goes dark too quickly. Something collapses. Someone shouts. On a closer ridge, smoke pours sideways in a way that suggests damp wood and poor planning. A fire brigade is summoned somewhere 3 valleys away because someone has been overly enthusiastic with a kerosene-soaked log. You cannot have an Edwardian national spectacle without a mild disaster, but it doesn't break the moment. If anything, it makes it more human. You sit down on the grass as heat rolls across your shins and the air cools behind your back. The fire roars, steady and loud, and you feel very small in a way that doesn't hurt. You feel connected not through history books but through pure, shared experience. Somewhere across the darkness, other people sit like this too. Other people stare into flame light. Other people feel that strange, soft shock of being alive at the exact same moment as strangers miles away, watching the same language of fire. You think about the old stories, beacons lit to warn of invasion, fires built to guide lost travelers, signal flames burning along coastlines in ages when light meant survival. That part at least is real history. Fire as message, fire as warning, fire as link. Tonight it's being used as something gentler. Fire as memory, fire as hope. Fire as pretending, just for a few hours, that the world is smaller and warmer and more connected than it usually feels. As the flames settle into a deep, consistent roar, people begin to sit closer together. Shoulders lean into shoulders. Someone passes around a tin of sweets. Another person produces tea from a flask like they planned for this to be emotionally devastating and came prepared. You lie back slightly, looking up. Above you, the sky is smeared with smoke and scattered stars. Sparks drift up, rise, disappear. Each one is a tiny borrowed sun. Each one is someone's small, ridiculous prayer. In the far distance, you swear you can still see other fires, dots of steady orange on black hills, like the country is breathing in light instead of smoke. You realize very quietly, very deeply, this is the peak. This is as bright as it gets. Not perfect, not clean, not historically accurate in the way scholars crave, but real in a way that no archive can ever build. 1,000 fires, one long night, and you right in the middle of it, warmed not just by flame but by the knowledge that sometimes people can still agree to gather in the dark and make something beautiful burn. You wake to the smell of salt and coal smoke braided together in a way that tells you you've been moved again, not backward or forward in time but outward, carried like a quiet ember beyond the tight island boundaries into a larger, stranger world. The fire didn't stay on the hills. It traveled. Boarded ships. It found its way into trunks and pamphlets and gossip and the curious luggage of empire. You find yourself walking through a colonial exhibition ground, the kind of place where everything smells faintly of fresh paint, damp canvas, and the awkward tension of cultures being stuffed into pavilions like curiosities. The bonfire here is smaller, more controlled, surrounded by rope barriers and signs that say things like celebratory pyre, do not approach WHILSD alike. Edwardians loved rules, especially around things that could burn guests. This part is historically real. World's fairs and imperial exhibitions were full of heritage displays, where tradition was staged like furniture. Fires were built not just for warmth or ritual, but for spectacle, for demonstration, for proof that the old ways were being preserved, even when they were being reinvented minutes earlier. You walk past a group of men in tailored suits debating how to make the fire seem authentic but not alarming. One insists the flames should be taller. Another worries about insurance forms. A third suggests adding harmless foreign woods for extra smoke effect. You drift further through the grounds and notice the absurdity of it. A Celtic fire tradition burning politely in a roped circle beside exhibits about steam engines, telegraph wires, and rubber harvesting. Ancient-looking flames flickering under banners celebrating modern conquest. Historians still argue whether these exported festivals were acts of cultural sharing or subtle messaging about imperial power. From where you stand, it feels like both, braided together so tightly they can't be separated. You board a ship next, not physically but mentally, because this is how the story moves, like an ember jumping from log to log. On the deck of a long steamer, expatriate Britons gather on a warm foreign night. The stars look wrong. The air smells like spices and unfamiliar plants. Someone has built a small bonfire out of imported wood and local scrap, and they speak in hushed, reverent tones about keeping the home fire alive. A woman tells you, "It doesn't burn the same out here." She's right. The smoke is different. The wood cracks differently. Even the shadows feel like they don't really belong to the same story. But people gather anyway. They hold teacups. They sing the songs. They mess up the chants in exactly the same way. In Australia, you walk across dry grass that crunches too easily underfoot. The fear of real, uncontrollable fire sits just beneath the surface of the celebration. Safety buckets are everywhere. People laugh too loudly, check the wind too often. In Canada, the bonfires are cautious and polite, built against backdrops of endless tree lines and cooling lakes. Someone insists that the northern air makes the flames look purer. Another insists this is obviously nonsense but enjoys the poetry of it. Everywhere the ritual shifts, thickens, changes color. The chants soften, the dances shorten, the symbolism adapts. Some people lean harder into Celtic imagery. Others soften it, blend it, lose it entirely. In some places, the fire becomes more of a picnic centerpiece than a ritual core. In others, it becomes a quiet, private thing, a nod instead of a spectacle. You overhear an argument in a far-off club hall where a man insists, "The fire meant we were never truly alone." Another replies, "Or that we missed home more than we thought." Both are true. What you feel most strongly isn't triumph or spread, it's dilution. Not in a bad way, just in the way that ink spreads in water, softer, wider, less sharp, more gentle. The fires become memory fires, not ritual fires. Nostalgia fires, comfort fires. The world moves faster, steamships, telegraph cables, artificial lights blooming in cities that never used to glow after sunset. Out here, far from the original hills, the bonfires aren't trying to wake ancient spirits. They're trying to make people feel less lost. You stand at the edge of one small fire on a distant shore. The waves are dark. The night is warm. A few people talk quietly. Someone laughs. Someone stares into the flames without blinking. You understand something now that you didn't when the first hill flared alive. Traditions don't spread whole. They travel as fragments, smells, songs, movements, tiny burning ideas. And as the flames snap and settle in a land that never held Celtic stones or druidic whispers, you see what the fire has become. Not a beacon, not a command. Just a small, stubborn warmth that people carry when the world feels too large. And here, far from the original blaze, it still matters. Quietly, gently. You feel the cooling long before you see it, like the slow settling of ash after weeks of crackle and roar. And the world around you begins to quiet in ways that don't feel like loss, only like the changing of temperature. The fires are still there, technically, but they've become smaller, more polite, more controlled. The way all wild things eventually get trimmed down to fit modern schedules and insurance policies. You walk through a town square that once held roaring pyres and now holds a neat metal brazier with a safety railing and a laminated sign. It reads, "Midsummer Observance Supervised Lighting Only." You smile because of course it does. The mainstream historical truth hums gently in the background. The First World War arrives and changes everything. That is real, fact, entirely non-negotiable. Men vanish from villages. Laughter changes shape. Bonfires become less about celebration and more about silence, about missing faces, about the way fire can warm hands while not warming the heart. You stand beside one of these smaller fires and feel the difference. It burns, but it does not leap. It glows, but it does not roar. Children are shushed instead of encouraged to run wild. Songs are sung lower. Dances become sways. Historians still argue whether the revival died because of war, modernization, or simple cultural exhaustion, and you can feel all three settling in like gentle fog. The old debates don't go away. They just soften. People stop fighting to prove authenticity and start quietly accepting that the fire, however it started, did something good for a while. You smell coal smoke more often now than pine. Gas lamps glow where firelight once ruled. Electric bulbs begin to flicker into life in wealthier neighborhoods. Streets become brighter, nights become safer, and yet somehow darker in the way that matters. You visit a hill where one of the great blazes once burned. The grass has grown back thick. Stones lie cold. Someone has left a small circle of charred wood pieces as if trying to mark a memory that won't stay in one shape. You sit down. The wind is gentle. The sky is wide. You think about all the hands that built those fires. The volunteers with their mismatched chants. The scholars arguing over meaning. The dancers who tripped and laughed. The children who stared, unblinking, at sparks rising like tiny stars. You realize none of it is gone. It's folded into quieter rituals now. Into candles lit in windows. Into match strikes in hearths. Into the way people still pause when they pass a fire, even now. Some villages continue the old midsummer habit, but it's changed. Less show, fewer horns, more silence. Families gather instead of committees. Simple log stacks instead of towering pyres. A handful of herbs if someone remembers, and sometimes no herbs at all. Someone near you murmurs, "They used to be bigger." You answer softly, "They used to need to be." The world moves forward, trains get faster, cities grow higher, Lives get louder, but fire stays the same. A flick, a spark, a breath. In quiet parlors, older people tell younger ones about a time the hills burned with light, not as warning, not as fear, but as joy, as belonging. The stories blur at the edges. Was it really that big? Did that many hills truly burn? Did people really dance like that? It doesn't matter. What matters is how their voices change when they talk about it. Softer, warmer, like they're remembering being held. And eventually you feel the night wrapping around you again, slower now, gentler, like a blanket settling instead of a spark catching. You walk away from the last small flame, knowing it doesn't need to follow you. You carry its warmth instead. And now the night loosens its grip, the images soften, and the fire becomes something less loud and more lasting. The hills cool, the sparks stop flying, the smoke thins into memory. You feel the tiredness settle in, not heavy, not sharp, but slow, like warm water rising around you. Your breath lengthens, shoulders drop. The world doesn't demand anything of you anymore. Somewhere very far away, a last harmless ember glows, just enough to remind you that warmth can exist without noise, that light doesn't have to shout to be real. You are safe. You are still. You are warm. Each thought slows, stretching out into long, gentle pauses between breaths. The smell of smoke fades. The sound of crackle fades. Even the idea of fire fades, leaving behind only a quiet sense of glow inside your chest. Nothing to prove. Nothing to chase, nothing to hold too tightly. Just the soft understanding that some stories burn hot and fast and others burn low and long, and this one tonight has done exactly what it needed to do. You let yourself drift, and if you listen very closely, you can almost hear the softest whisper. It's all right now. Close your eyes. The fire is gentle. Sweet dreams.